Hey everyone, for those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I write a regular story for a website called Nation of Change. Every week you can find the stories. If you're on my blog, you can find them here. If you're on YouTube, you can find a link to the blog below. I've been excited by the response to my last video. I just kind of left YouTube aside and wasn't getting too many views. My last video got quite a few, so if you're here and you like the content, please subscribe. I think it's that way or that way. Yeah, just thanks very much for dropping in. So today I'm going to look at two different stories. One I think is basically what I'm researching for next week's story for Nation of Change. And the first one is every time there's a new story by Seymour M. Hersh, it's really news because so many great stories have been broken by him, starting with the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in the 60s, all the way to debunking several things about chemical weapons attacks in Syria over the last couple of years. The progress of his career is really interesting because Hersh started out, of course, at the New York Times and spent many years, up to a few years after September 11th, 2001, he was still at the New Yorker. But in recent years, he hasn't been able to actually find, as far as I can tell, an American outlet to publish his work. He's mostly been publishing through the London Review of Books, but he actually did publish his last article in a German newspaper because he actually couldn't get the LRB to publish it either. So his new story, it's a historical take, but it's really important in a sense because it shows the continuity in the American government between the H.W. Bush regime and the Bush Jr. regime, and even to a certain extent the Trump kind of anarchy that there is now. So he basically is talking about the time around the Iran-Contra scandal in the 80s and the view that Ronald Reagan was seen as kind of incurious and like a little bit incompetent. He was starting to kind of even lose his grip around 1985, I think, which is basically when he starts the story. And Bush, of course, a former head of the CIA, was none of these things. He was seen as pretty competent. And basically what he did was, although the Iran-Contra affair was huge at the time, it was actually just a small operation within a larger number of operations, an operation that actually went wrong because, as Hersh reports, they actually used the wrong people like Oliver North. But these operations, there were 14 or 15 of them that Hersh was able to verify through his sources. Some of them were successful. He doesn't actually go into any details on any one. So we are relying on kind of the testimony of Hersh's. He has a really good network, as far as anyone can tell, of really former and even probably current high-level officials within security agencies within the United States. So what comes out of this, it's really interesting, is that what had to be a secret in the time of George H.W. Bush, and really George H.W. Bush, according to Hersh's take, was really in charge of all these covert ops. Reagan just didn't have much of an interest in them and didn't know very much. Is very similar to Donald Trump in this sense, a very incurious person in a very important position. So Bush Sr. was running these operations, which were very similar to what we have now, widespread, that everyone knows about. It's kind of a obviously meant to be a secret, but it's not a secret, that you have the Joint Special Operations Command, these teams of people, engaged in all kinds of things around the world. I mean, we barely find out about them until something happens, usually to one of these people, like what happened in Niger with the Green Berets, or what happened in Somalia. I think there was a drone bombing and I can't verify that right now because I can't remember the exact story, but it's really interesting that this was already in development, this idea of these kind of secret teams of, we saw the thing with Pablo Escobar in Colombia a few years later. It was Delta Force now that we believe took him out. So even though this seems like something from very much from our own era, this was actually something that was already kind of ongoing at that time, which is both interesting and scary. So, and it just goes to show you, with George H.W. Bush, I mean, the way when he died, the way it was as if they were burying some kind of secular saint. This is a man who did a lot of damage. I mean, the first Gulf War, you would not have, the years and years of sanction. We might have had a war with Iraq under George W. Bush. I guess it's possible if there hadn't been the Desert Storm invasion. But it's hard to argue that putting in place the sanctions and everything, which were then, of course, intensified by the Clinton administration, 500,000 Iraqis, perished as a result of this. Children perished as a result of this. And it just seems strange to have, the leader at that time be just so, and even George W. Bush now, I mean, after the absolute disaster of the Iraq War, like, why are we, because Trump's in office, trying to kind of legitimize his rule? He was terrible. Dick Cheney was terrible. I mean, it's not even that long ago, and people are already like, oh, many liberals, I long for the days of George W. Bush. That is completely insane. Anyway, so my story for next week for Nation of Change, I think it's going to be, I'm still researching it, but I think it's going to be about this it's a new service. It's through an app or through a website. It's called Newsguard. There's a second part to it called Brand Guard, which isn't as heavily advertised, but which is also very important because it allows brands to determine whether they want advertising on certain streams through the internet, I guess using Google or whatever. But Newsguard is basically all new Microsoft devices are coming with the Edge browser has this built in. And what it does is it gives a color-coded rating, kind of like the old terror rating in the United States, for those who remember, from green to red, basically green, yellow, or red. A website is trustworthy if it's green, obviously, and if it's red, it's not trustworthy. But then, as reporters have started looking into this, they noticed that WikiLeaks has a red mark against it, even though WikiLeaks has actually never been proven to have false information on its site, much more so than, there's been so many scandals with the Washington Post, for example, having that thing about the Vermont electricity grid being hacked. The Washington Post has a green rating. Fox News has a green rating on this service. But other websites like RT, of course, and Sputnik, different Russian websites, which do sometimes, show the Russian point of view of the world, are also shown as untrustworthy, which, I mean, it's simply not fair. And basically, if you look at if you actually go to their site, I highly encourage it, and you look at different descriptions that they give for different websites, like for the Fox News one, for example, it just looks like an ad for Fox News. It's a factually accurate but conservative point of view, is basically what they say. So that's a couple stories that I was looking at. You should definitely check out the Seymour Hersh story, All the Vice President's Men or the Vice President's Men. I will put a link to it below here on the YouTube, or if you're on the blog as always, but I'm going to start putting the links also here on the YouTube. So I hope you'll click through, read it, and I hope everyone out there is doing really well and you're all enjoying your lives. And always remember,